security as an elite hacker. This year, we've got another twist for you. We've had in the past papers on metrics, security metrics, and we have some this year, and they've been very popular. Ways of measuring how secure your system is. But that number or that grade doesn't necessarily tell you the impact to your system. And it makes it hard to make a business case with management. And we hear this in a lot of events, not just S4, but how do I make the business case? How do I convince people that this is the impact of an attack? And in thinking about that, we said we really need someone who understands economics and can tie economics to information security. So we went out and looked for the leader in that field, and after asking a number of people, we found that the leader in economics and information security was Dr. Ross Anderson from University of Cambridge. It was funny when you ask the same question to a bunch of people and get one man as an answer, it's pretty easy to figure out who you want as your keynote. And Dr. Anderson was kind enough to fly across and be our keynote speaker. So let me just give you a brief introduction of him. Dr. Ross Anderson is a professor of security engineering at the University of Cambridge in the UK. He's very well known in the information security community for his book, Security Engineering. I'm sure many of you have read and seen Security Engineering. It's now out in its second edition, very recently here. In recent years, Dr. Anderson has focused and pioneered a new field of study, the economics of information security. He has numerous publications in this area, and if you want to see those, if you just Google Ross Anderson and go to his site, you will see a plethora of papers on all different topics, economics, psychology of security, security protocols. It's really a great resource. So he has a lot of publications there, and importantly, he was one of the founders of the highly regarded workshop on the economics of information security. So please welcome Dr. Ross Anderson.
You got me on, yeah, okay, the microphone's working. Fine, so the economics of information security and what can control engineers learn from that? Well, I thought I'd start with a brief history of this field. I didn't train as an economist. I started off as a mathematician, and then I got a qualification in computer engineering. I worked in avionics for a while in healthcare systems, and through the 80s I was working in banking. And in the early 1990s, in the recession before the current one, I found myself sitting at my desk, paying the secretary, paying the rent, playing computer games because there were no customers. And I said to myself, well, I always said I'd do a PhD one day. Obviously, today is the day. And so through the 90s, I have been an academic working firstly in the technical aspects of security, crypto and protocols and firewalls and stuff like that. And all through the 1990s, we believed that the insecurity of the internet was due to a lack of features. So we went out and we invented features and more features, crypto, protocols, firewalls, you name it. But things didn't get any better. In fact, things seemed to be slowly getting worse. And so around about the end of the millennium, a number of us started to realize that this isn't enough. And economics provided the inspiration. In my case, I observed that in the UK, banks are much less liable for fraud when things go wrong than banks in America. Here you've got very strong consumer protection thanks to Regulation E. If you've got a phantom withdrawal or a disputed credit card transaction, you phone up the bank and get it taken off. In Europe, you've got much more hassle. You might think that European banks could therefore get away with spending less money on security. But actually, they spent more. So how could this be? I didn't understand that. Meanwhile, Hal Varian, who was then a professor of economics at Berkeley, had been asked by a number of his customers, why is it that people don't buy as much security software as they should? Everybody should have antivirus software. And he was worrying about that. The two of us got together, and something clicked. And Hal realized that one of the reasons that people didn't buy as much antivirus software as the vendors hoped is that by the year 2000, a virus which infected your computer wasn't just trashing your hard disk, it would use your computer to do distributed denial of service attacks against Amazon or Microsoft or whatever. And while somebody might pay $10 to protect their own computer from harm, why should you pay $10 for antivirus software if it's only going to protect other people from harm? And so this gave us the idea that security is often an externality. And we started working on this. And after a period of time, we started getting on to bigger and more interesting problems. And one of the biggest and most interesting problems is this. Why is so much commercial platform software, Windows, mobile phone platforms, and so on, why is it so insecure? If you've got a single dominant player, then surely that dominant player could, over a shortish period of time, rewrite the rules so that the product became secure. But this doesn't happen. And why should that be? Well, the fundamental insight is this, that security in systems often fails because the people who guard the system, or the people who could fix a system, aren't exposed to the full costs of failure. If you have got banks, as in the UK, who can brush aside customer complaints of fraud by saying, our systems are secure, you must be mistaken or lying, go away, then the developers won't make as much effort as developers working for US banks have to, where that kind of get-out isn't available. And if it's casino websites who suffer when infected PCs do denial of service attacks on them, then there's a problem there. The casino owners can't practically go out and buy antivirus software for all the machines that are attacking them. And in a well-ordered society, you wouldn't expect them to have to. So what's happening here is that insecurity is often an externality. This is a word that economists use for side effects. Now, there can be good side effects and bad side effects. A positive externality, for example, is scientific research. The scientific papers that we hear here today won't merely benefit the people who did the research, they'll benefit everybody else as well. So there's a positive externality. Environmental pollution is an example of a negative externality in all its various forms. And internet insecurity is very much like environmental pollution. So when you start thinking about malware on the internet, perhaps you can start thinking of acid rain or global warming or whatever, and see what ideas go backwards and forwards from one environment to the other. Okay, so this led to the field of security economics, which by now is a field with over 100 active researchers. Our annual workshop, the workshop on the economics of information security, is in London this year in June. And there's a vast range of topics that people look at. I've got a couple of guys who look at how you go about measuring online wickedness, how you go about looking at quantities of spam and phish and malware and so on, figuring out how many botnets there are and how big they are, econometrics. Other people look at digital rights management. How do you advise politicians on things like copyright term and DRM standards? And then there are other topics which are perhaps more relevant here. How do you manage the patching cycle? Control engineering looks like it's going to end up with the same kind of patching cycle that you find with, for example, Windows, perhaps with a longer time constant. What is there to be learned about the experience of other industries in patching? So the theme, the sub-theme of this talk is that we've got an awful lot of tools. This is a field that I'm coming to new, and so I would like to hear from you about what your problems are, because once we understand your problems, we probably find that we've got tools in the box that will fit. No guarantee, but we can try. Okay, what is it about information goods and services that makes IT markets different from, say, the market for cars or the market for potatoes? This is one of the things that we worked out early on, and it's, I think, worthwhile taking 5 minutes to work through it. Well, the first distinguishing characteristic of information goods, such as software, or information services, such as broadband access to your home, is that you get network effects. What a network effect means is that the more people there are in a network, the more the network is worth. Right? So, for example, when Alexander Graham Bell manufactured the first 2 telephones, there was only one other person he could talk to, namely his assistant in the next room. Once he managed to sell a few hundred, that's obviously more valuable. Once he'd sold millions, that was more valuable still. Now, from the point of view of the average network user, you might say that the value of the network is equal to the number of other people you can speak to. So you might say that a network with n members has got value n squared. It's actually a little bit less than that. It's n log n and something or other, because you don't get very much benefit from the next billion people who join the internet, because none of them are people you know, but it gives you a flavor of what's going on. Now, this applies not just to real networks, such as phones and email and fax and so on, but also to virtual networks. A good example is the struggle that happened between the IBM PC, as it was then known in 1985, and the Apple Mac for domination of the personal computer market. As you may recall if you were around then, what happened was that for a period of time, people who developed software developed it for the PC and also for the Mac, because nobody knew who was going to win. But towards the end of 1985, people figured out, well, the IBM is going to win for sure, because big corporates like Exxon and BP and Citicorp and so on have gone for IBM PCs. So all the developers started developing stuff for IBM PCs first, and Macs second, if at all. And so the IBM PC took over the market, and Microsoft grabbed that from IBM because the platform was a critical part of that rather than the hardware, and Apple was relegated to a secondary position. We've seen exactly the same thing again recently, when Symbian, for example, took over the mobile phone platform market from most of its competitors. So what we'll observe there is that network effects tend to lead to dominant firm markets where the winner takes all. Now, the second feature that you have in IT product and service markets is that you've got high fixed costs and low marginal costs. The first copy of Windows Vista that Microsoft shipped cost them $5 or $10 billion. The second and subsequent copies cost them pennies. Okay? Now, this is nothing particularly new. You see the same kind of effects with a number of other markets, telcos, hotels, airlines. And the problem facing such businesses is that if you get price competition, it drives the price down to the marginal cost of production, which is almost nothing in the case of information goods. And this means that it can be very hard to recover your capital investment, unless you've got something like a brand or compatibility or a patent or copyright or whatever in order to place a floor underneath the price. And these effects also lead to dominant firm market structures. Now, the third fascinating thing about IT goods and services market is switching. Switching from one product or service to another is expensive. Let me give you an example. Suppose you've got a firm with 100 people working there, say a law firm with 100 lawyers busy suing people and doing house deeds and stuff like that. Now, you might have spent $500 per person on Office and Windows to provide them the platform to do their word processing and spreadsheets. Now, you could, if you wanted, move everybody to OpenOffice and Linux. But that would mean that you'd have to incur a number of costs. You'd have to retrain people. Okay? You'd have to convert files. You'd have to do all sorts of stuff like that. So how much would this switching cost you? Well, the answer is $50,000. Because if it would cost you less to switch, then lots of people would switch. And if it cost you more to switch, then Microsoft would put up its prices. Now, if you write that down as a theorem with proper assumptions and so on, you can actually prove that the net present value of a software company is the total switching costs. And this is a really valuable insight because it shows why, for example, you get so much lock-in behavior in consumer electronics. You go and buy an iPod for $300, then you spend $3,000 on songs that you download, or $3,000 worth of your time going through your CD collection one at a time and ripping them into iTunes. And now you're locked in. For the rest of your life, you'll be giving Apple $300 every 2 years to replace your iPod. Great, isn't it? Now, what has this got to do with security? Well, control engineers are always complaining about the poor quality of the engineering in commercial platforms like Windows. All sorts of engineers complain about this. Healthcare people do, avionics people do. It's a common complaint. And in fact, when I used to consult with Microsoft 15, 20 years ago, when they were still a small firm battling against the IBM Goliath, it was actually said on campus, we're going to ship it on Tuesday and get it right by version 3. That was the internal proverb. Now, some people said that this was a personal moral failing of Bill Gates. However, I hope I've brought you to the point where you can realize that given the nature of the software market, where with all these three factors going together, high fixed costs, low marginal costs, network effects, and switching costs, if you've got all these three working together, you're going to, with high probability, have a dominant firm market structure where whoever is in first gets all the gravy. Therefore, you've got an industry structure dominated by near monopolies, which are chosen by market races. And as a result, ship it Tuesday and get it right by version 3 is a strategy that's going to be followed by whichever firm wins in that market. And it's not just Windows. We've seen this before in all sorts of other applications, for example, mobile phone software. You may recall that 3 years ago, Symbian suddenly moved from UIQ2 to UIQ3. Basically, they did what Microsoft did between Windows 95 and Windows 2000, and they started putting in things like access controls. So you expect that in a market like this, you will find the following behavior. Because when you're building a network monopoly, you have to appeal to the vendors of complementary products. Symbian, when it was building its near monopoly in smartphone software, had to appeal to all the people who write games. And so putting in access control and certificates and stuff like that would have been a killer. People might have developed for Windows CE or something else instead. So you start off with a bare platform, you get your network monopoly, and you put the security in later. That's exactly what Microsoft did. That's exactly what IBM did with mainframe software back in the 1960s. It is a completely predictable pattern. Another thing that we find is that you go and look at the protocols we use to protect the internet. SSL is not really fit for purpose, is it? That again goes back to a similar market race back in the mid-1990s. Because in 1995, there were two protocols were basically vying to be the protocol that people would use to secure online commerce. There was SSL, which was cheap and cheerful, quick and dirty. And there was SET, which was properly engineered. It had digital signatures, public key infrastructures, and all this machinery that Whit Diffie and his followers invented. And guess what got adopted? SSL got adopted. Why? Because that enabled people to roll out electronic commerce faster. It enabled them to build their positions in online business. And of course, since about 2004, we have been suffering as a result of all the phishing that was the inevitable consequence of going for a weak protocol to secure online payments. But the reason that SSL defeated SET is, I think, clear once you understand the underlying economics. Now that we understand why Windows, Symbian, and other such platform solutions are as insecure as they are, perhaps the interesting thing for this community is to ask, how is SCADA different? Well, control systems have even higher switching costs. If you've got an oil refinery and you want to pull out GE stuff and put in Honeywell stuff instead, hey, that's going to cost an absolute shed load of money. And in practice, nobody's going to do it. Competition, is it dominated by market races? No, it isn't. What you find is that the decision to use one particular vendor's products is taken at the beginning of a project, and then that vendor is basically locked in for 25 years or so on one particular installation. Do we have models of this elsewhere in the information security world? Well, as it happens, we do have one or two. An example is set-top boxes, the set-top boxes that you get from your cable service provider to decrypt the content that he sends you. And there are some interesting results there if you look at the literature. For example, it's possible usually for a cable operator to negotiate a contract with his set-top box supplier that offsets the cost of the lock-in over the box life cycle. But what has been difficult in the set-top box market is that as it is a duopoly with two suppliers in the USA, the level of innovation has been an awful lot less than the cable industry would have wanted. If you had had a monopoly cable set-top box supplier, It would have been more expensive, but that vendor would have had an incentive to innovate, to compete with the internet, broadly defined. And if you had had half a dozen set-top box suppliers, they would have competed amongst each other. So that there are some potentially useful insights there. So what I'm going to do for the next 15 or 20 minutes is to look at a number of other themes from security economics that may be useful or applicable in this particular space. And one of the theories that we've looked at from time to time is conflict theory. Is a kind of game theory that was developed by the late Jack Hirschleifer at UCLA and his followers. He was interested in the circumstances in which people will fight rather than cooperate, and how you analyze fighting behavior as opposed to cooperative behavior, because economics is basically about people cooperating, but what happens when there's conflict? Well, one of the things that you can look at is whether the defense of a country or a system or whatever depends on the laziest of the defenders, the least effort made by any of the defenders, the greatest effort made by any defender, or the sum total of all the efforts of the defenders. In other words, how well are the defenders coordinated? Jack Hirschleifer came up with the story of the island of Anarchia. An island, think Venice, in a low-lying lagoon, where each family owns a slice of the pie and is responsible for maintaining its part of the seawall. As a result of this, the defense of the island against flooding depends on the efforts of the laziest family. So what's going to happen? Hey, you're going to have to learn to swim. And wherever you look in the world, where there are islands that have got a collective sea defense problem, Venice, places in the South Pacific and so on, you find that there is strong municipal government. Why? Because otherwise it's just not viable. The second possibility is best effort. Think medieval knights in armor, or the Battle of Bannockburn, 1314, England versus Scotland. So Henry de Bohun of England goes out before the English troops and says, "You Scots are a bunch of cowards. Is there a single man amongst you to come out and fight me?" So Robert the Bruce goes out and chops the Bohun's head off. And this so demoralizes the English troops that the following day at Bannockburn, the Scots defeat the English. Right? This is how things were done in medieval times. Now that's better than weakest link, because somebody, namely the hero, has got an enormous incentive to put a lot of effort into defense. He gets to be king, he gets to own the country, and he gets his choice of the women. Right? That's very strong incentive in medieval terms. But again, it's still suboptimal. This kind of tribal warfare doesn't cut it against a modern army, because a modern state which raises taxes from its citizens and then hires troops can deploy much greater defensive or offensive resources. So what does this tell us about engineering? Well, look, for example, at software. Software is a mix of least effort, best efforts, and sum of efforts. The buffer overflows that cause your software to be vulnerable will be introduced typically by your lousiest, laziest programmer. So that's a least effort case. The testers, the people who test your software, are in effect working in parallel. So that's sum of efforts, like a modern army. Whereas the security architect, the guy who obsesses over your interfaces and libraries and keeps the attack surface as small as possible, he is the hero. He is the guy with the battle axe on his horse who can turn the whole battle one way or another. So the lesson here is you should hire fewer but better programmers, you should hire more testers, and you should hire the best architects that your budget will afford. And as someone who turns out people with PhDs in computer security, I quite like this result. How does this apply to the world of industrial control systems? Well, as I started reading around in this field a few weeks ago as preparation for doing this talk, I'm fascinated to find that here in the USA, you've gone for a regulatory solution to deal with the coordination problem. You've got NERC-CIP, which basically says what sort of stuff electricity generators and transmission service providers and so on should do. Whereas in the UK, via CPNI, we're going for a private sector solution. We're basically getting together people involved in various sectors and saying, look, you guys are all these security managers of oil companies. here, let's go for lunch and have a beer and talk about all our problems, and then you will be able to be more intelligent customers of the vendors. And the world is usually the other way around. It's usually the USA that goes for a free market solution and Europe goes for regulation, but hey, it'll be interesting to see the outcomes. It's also going to be interesting to see different outcomes by different industry, because if you've got electricity regulated while petrochemicals isn't, are we going to see something significant over the next few years? And I'm going to be very interested to see what your experience is of this as it develops. And the fact that there are some countries that care and some countries that don't care, looking around Europe, should give us some more data points. So there's potentially a very interesting natural experiment about to be done here in the effects of regulation and cooperation. What I suspect is that a whole lot of stuff will come down on the detail. Now, one of the things that we've been concerned about in another context is the provision of reserve capacity for dealing with emergencies. That's another aspect of the coordination problem. And for example, during the run-up to Y2K, one of the concerns in Britain was the effect of privatizing our telephone industry. Because when the phone network was run by the government back in the early 1980s, every telephone exchange had 6 weeks diesel on the premises. So, basically this was there in order to survive World War III. But by the time we got to 1999, we found that the typical phone network, and there are 5 competing mobile phone networks, was down to something like 2 or 3 days of reserve power in batteries or generators at mobile phone masts. And this caused people to think, well, hey, what happens if electric power goes down for 3 days and you can't bring up the electric power network again without the phone network, and then the phone network is down? So people started worrying about these coordination problems. Anyway, that's for background. Again, reading around, I'm interested to see that we've got some reports at a conference last year of NARC SIP compliance games. There was a paper there reporting that some managers were taking black start capability away from coal-fired power generators so that these assets would no longer be critical and they'd no longer have to go and buy firewalls for them. Now, somehow or another, the pricing there is wrong. If it's simpler to throw a diesel generator on the skip than it is to go and buy a firewall, then the regulator hasn't got it right. And this is going to be interesting to watch. Now, we do have a number of other data points on how people behave when subjected to these kind of regulatory pressures. And there's a significant literature on adverse selection and moral hazard. As for what these are, it's well known that Volvo drivers have more accidents than drivers of other cars like Chrysler. Now, and this happens in every country. Now, why should this be? There are basically 2 theories. The first theory is that people who know they're lousy drivers buy Volvos so they won't get killed, right? And the second is that people who strap on a Volvo think, whoopee, really safe, I can drive 10 miles an hour faster. Well, my wife used to have a Volvo, and I must confess that I am a moral hazard guy. I'm a guy who drives 10 miles an hour faster, rather than a guy who gets a Volvo so as not to be killed. Because like 98% of the rest of the population, I believe that I'm a better than average driver, right? So I'm doing moral hazard, not adverse selection, right? You see that this begins to get slightly complicated. Well, there are some interesting pieces of research on this. A wonderful paper by Ben Edelman, who's a researcher at Harvard, Adverse Selection and Online Trust Certifications, which appeared at WISE 3 years ago. Many of you are probably aware that there's a scheme called Trustee, which is a self-regulatory scheme set up by the usual suspects, Microsoft, IBM, and so on, so that if you have got a website with a privacy policy, you can go to Trustee, give them some money, and you can then use their badge on your website saying that you're a good website. So what Ben did was to go and gather a selection of random websites with Trustee certification and a selection of random websites that didn't, and he found that the certified websites were more than twice as likely to be malicious, in the sense that they tried to put spyware on your PC or indulged in other bad behavior. Why? Well, adverse selection. If you're a bad man running a spyware website, then you're much more likely than a respectable guy to go and buy a certificate saying that you're good. So having done this, Ben then went and looked at Google, and he compared the top editorial search result, that is the free search result, versus the top paid advert for a number of standard business queries. And he found that the top paid for advertising result was about twice as likely to be malicious. And Google was, in fact, the best search engine. With Yahoo, it was about 6 times more likely that the top paid search ad would be malicious than the top editorial search would be malicious. So Ben's conclusion there was, don't click on ads. Hal Varian, who founded Security Economics with me, has now got a job as Google's chief economist. And they've set up a research lab where they're hiring economics PhDs who are experts in things like game theory and auction theory and so on, because this kind of thing is clearly highly relevant to their business. Another thread that's worth looking at is open versus closed. There's a big debate, I believe, in this community about the virtues of open systems, not just in the sense of open source, but also in the sense of open reporting of vulnerabilities and of security breaches, versus the proprietary approach where you keep everything locked down as in the same way, for example, that the NSA does. Now, this debate actually goes back to the 17th century. I've first been able to track it down in the Cromwellian Wars. Cromwell's signal security officer, John Wilkins, was an advocate of openness. It came up again in the 19th century, where people had a debate about whether it should be allowed to publish books on locksmithing. And it's come up again in the 20th century with the crypto wars over the last 20 years. One of the things that we did was to show that if you are operating in the standard reliability growth model, that is where you've got enough bugs for the central limit theorem to hold and where they're uncorrelated, then openness and closed systems are equivalent in that opening up a system will help the attackers and the defenders equally. So what this means is that if you want to determine whether a particular application should be run open or closed, then you have to look at the ways in which your application differs from the standard model. And we've had people doing this. I had a research student, for example, looked at the bugs in OpenBSD, found that they were correlated, and concluded that at least in the operating system space, it's a good idea to have open systems and open bug reporting. But that isn't all of the story. At WISE 2004, we had a big debate about this, because on the one hand, an awful lot of the exploits then as now related to systems, to vulnerabilities for which a patch was available, but people who hadn't patched their systems were the people who were exploited. And Eric Riscarla argued that since there are statistically many bugs and removing them doesn't much affect the probability of finding subsequent bugs, and given that most of the damage is post-patching, you would actually be better to go to a closed system. Aurora and others looked at both the economic theory and the econometrics and argued that without patching, that without eventual open disclosure, vendors would never patch and various other things would go wrong. And the argument that came from this is that it's optimal to disclose after a delay. And as you know, this is now what happens in the world of CERT. Typically after a month and a half or so, vulnerabilities that are reported to CERT are reported publicly. In the meantime, the vendor has had a chance to manufacture and distribute a patch. So, big question, should all this apply to control systems? Possibly with a different time constant. Possibly the delay is not going to be a month and a half, but a year and a half. That may be an empirical question that we have to look at with respect to data from the field. My point is that this is a debate that has been had already in another context, and a significant amount of serious work has been done on it. Next thread, metrics. Dale mentioned metrics. Are they a problem? Sure. Pretty well everywhere where security or risk, even in the dependability sense, is dealt with, metrics are hard. Recently, with the credit crunch, the world's regulators have realized that the value at risk approach has got its limits. This is the approach where you say, what's the worst thing that can happen, and what's the probability that it will happen this year? Therefore, that's, if you like, an insurance premium that we should pay to an insurance company or notionally accrue internally in order to offset the likelihood of a risk materializing. Now, in the security world, we've known, I suppose, for 15 or 20 years that this isn't ideal, and people have been looking around for other things. What can you do? Insurance markets? Well, in some cases this works, in other cases it doesn't. And we saw during Y2K that many insurers withdrew cover. Why? Because if things went wrong, it was reckoned there would be a cascade failure, and where you've got correlated risk, the costs of providing insurance become uneconomic and markets fill. Next possibility, make a market in vulnerabilities. If it were possible for somebody who'd found a zero-day exploit in Windows to go and sell it for money, then the price of these vulnerabilities would give you some idea of how secure Windows was. That was an idea that Stuart Schachter came out in 2003, and there's now 2 or 3 companies which do it. Next possibility, stock markets. We've got an awful lot of information on the value of companies as assessed by the market. There have been a lot of incidents in which companies have disclosed security breaches, especially since California passed its security breach disclosure law. So you can look at what the effect is on company value and get some idea of the cost of a breach from that. And what we know is that when a company reports a breach, the share price typically drops a couple of % and recovers after a week or so. What we also know is that if a company reports 2 successive breaches, then the damage can be significantly higher. This then takes us to the topic that Dale was mentioning earlier. How much should we spend? How much should the average company spend on information security? Now, for the 20 years or so that I've been involved in this business, governments and vendors have been saying, you should spend 10 times as much as you're spending now. Surprise, surprise. Markets are usually right in the medium term. So you can make a convincing argument that the total expenditure may be about right, but it's quite likely to be low and high. Low in some industries, high in others. Low in some types of firm, and high in other types of firm. One of the things that's been found is that big firms tend to spend more than small firms, and this is a personnel selection effect. Risk managers in big corporations tend to be accountants who are selected and trained to be risk averse, whereas security purchasing decisions in small firms are typically made by the business owner who, as an entrepreneur, has been selected as a risk-loving person. What you also find is that industries have got time lags. It may take an industry 5 years or 10 years to realize that it should be spending more on a particular field. And this may be a very salient effect in the matter of control systems. As firms are learning one after another that it would be a good idea to protect their system, this may spread through the industry, and so you may be seeing a time lag effect. Another problem that you see is what's referred to by economists as agency effects. Let me give you an example. Suppose you're the director of NSA and one of your scientists comes rushing into your office at Fort Meade saying, boss, I've got this super exploit in Windows. Format string vulnerability, type in the following 11 characters, and you've rooted that machine. Works in SP, works in Vista, just great. What do you do with this? Okay, what are you going to do as director NSA? Do you tell Microsoft and protect 300 million Americans? Or do you keep quiet about it for the time being, and then you can attack 400 million Europeans and 1,000 million Chinese and so on and so forth? So you see there's already a bit of a bias that may move you to favor offense over defense. Now here comes the agency effect. Suppose you are optimizing your own utility as well as your employer's utility. You may think, if the Chinese hack the LAN in the White House, they're going to keep very quiet about it, so it's going to be no skin off my nose. But if we can hack the LAN in the Politburo in Beijing, then I can see to it that I've got a digest of what's being said there on President Obama's breakfast table every morning at 7 o'clock. and then I can go in and get billions of dollars more budget. So there's going to be an even stronger temptation to favor offense over defense. And back during the crypto wars in the 1990s, we didn't understand why organizations like the NSA had such a strong bias in favor of offense. I think this may be part of the answer. So putting that together, how should governments do information security policy? Well, one of the projects that we did about a year ago was to write a report, Security Economics and the Single Market, for the European Network and Information Security Agency. Now, that's an agency in Europe which, unlike the NSA, is not involved in doing offensive foreign intelligence. Its mission is purely defensive and regulatory. And so the biases that I talked about in the previous slide aren't present. And we come up with 15 recommendations, of which I've got the most salient here. Firstly, that Europe, like 30-odd American states, should have a security breach disclosure law. That's now being worked on in the European Parliament. And there's some negotiation about the scope of it, but it's clearly going to happen. Second, there should be data collected on which ISPs host malware, so that pressure can be brought to bear on lazy ISPs to clean up their act. Third, and this may be the most relevant for the SCADA security community, if you're going to attach a device to the network, if you're going to sell devices that talk IP, then you should be required to certify that these devices are secure by default. Now, why do we want this? Well, we're about to see all sorts of devices acquiring not just CPUs but communications and going online. So in future, your TV set, for example, is going to be an IP device. And what's more, it's probably going to have a Linux PC in it because it doesn't cost any more to put in a device there which enables the TV user to just call up Firefox and check his Gmail during the adverts. And given that the marginal cost of this is zero, lots of people will be doing it. Now, imagine in 5 years' time, if a television set that had been sold by Sony turns out to have a dreadful vulnerability and no mechanism to patch it, so all of a sudden you've got 20 million TV sets in Europe are recruited to a vast Russian botnet and start spewing out spam and phish and doing extortion attacks and all the rest of it. What we want to do is to make Sony liable for that. And so the objective of this requirement is that to sell its TVs, Sony will have to certify, not just as at present, that these abide by fire safety regulations and this safety and that safety and the next safety, but also that they are secure by default. That means that if this turns out not to be the case, they can't disclaim liability and they can be sued by ISPs or other affected persons. If there's going to be a legal duty in Europe that everything you connect to IP must be secure by default, does this make your job easier or harder? I suspect it makes your job an awful lot easier, because those vendors who aren't quite with it in terms of SCADA security will be pushed into a more responsible behavior. Yep.
When you say the network devices can be secured by default, sometimes that's not exactly practical. I mean, for example, we're dealing I'm on the DNP technical committee, DNP, popular SCADA protocol. If you say tomorrow that by default we should all be using secure authentication, the overhead will be significant and it will cause a lot of problems. And the question I get is, obviously some things don't really need to be secured, other things do, so there needs to be some kind of a dividing line on trying to figure out what to secure and where.
Well, so if this goes through in Europe, then what that presumably means for you is that you have to draw up some guidelines about what it means for a DMP device to be secure by default. Now, ENISA's concern is that you don't suddenly wake up one morning and find that there's 10 million valves in pipelines around Europe have been recruited to a botnet and started sending spam. Okay? So if your devices are not talking TCP IP, or if they are devices that have got the code in ROM and are therefore not capable of being infected, then this presumably doesn't affect you. But if you have got members of your community who are shipping what are in effect PCs, but with no means of patching them, then that is something that's going to have to be attended to. So the interpretation of a requirement like this is something that each individual industry would have to work with.
If you can hold your questions till the end, there's a good reason for that, because I got several complaints for the virtual attendees. They can't hear you when you talk, so that's why we wait till the end and we pass the mic around. But you'll get a chance.
Okay, last few slides now. Here are a number of other threads that I thought that I would just put forward and see if they led to any interesting discussion. As many of you may know, we had an attempted terrorist attack in London in 1996, where the IRA tried to blow up the 6 electricity substations that supply London with its electricity. Had they succeeded, the economic effects of this would have been colossal, potentially bigger than 9/11, because it was bad enough when Auckland lost power for a few months. If London had lost electric power for 6 months, that would have been complete wipeout. So scenarios like this enable us to argue that SCADA security is a significant issue on what until yesterday was called the war on terror. Is it still a big deal, or is it crying wolf? Is it one of the overblown aspects of the former war on terror that a rational society should now discard? How do you conduct that conversation? How do you enable policymakers at the top level to assess the priority of this program? Next point, institutional cultures, defense versus other firms. I get the feeling that in this field, as in many others, firms whose main business is in defense have got a bent towards proprietary solutions, whereas firms whose background is civil engineering or computer science have got a predilection for open solutions. Is this an issue here? And if so, how do we deal with it? What can we learn from the world of defense? It sometimes strikes me that what I see, or what I am told is happening in SCADA security now, is vaguely reminiscent of what was going on in the world of multi-level secure systems in the defense sector, in the mid-1980s. Because there, people were building very large numbers of systems that were essentially one-offs. You want a defense messaging system, you want a diplomatic messaging system, you want an intelligence agency messaging system. Each time it would be a separate contract, separate contractors, everybody reinvents the wheel, different boxes, different crypto, different word processor commands, the works. So everything took forever, it was monstrously expensive, and it didn't work very well. So you had the movement, first with the Orange Book and now with the Common Criteria, towards trying to build secure systems out of standard components that would plug and play. And the experience with this has been somewhat mixed. We do have a number of multi-level secure operating systems. The variants of Solaris, for example, are still used. The value that you got from them has been questioned. The division of efforts between the evaluation step of creating a trustworthy component and the accreditation step of seeing to it that that component is used in a system in a sensible way in a particular social and regulatory environment, that's a debate that continues. Failures of regulation are very, very common. We wrote a paper last year on the failure of common criteria evaluation in the context of the banking industry, where PIN entry devices, the PIN pads that you use when you do a transaction with a bank card and a PIN in your supermarket, were supposedly certified as secure and turned out, in fact, to be very easy to attack. And after we had attacked a couple of these and confronted the banking industry and the regulators with the result, we had everybody passing the blame to everybody else, and it became clear that the common criteria brand doesn't, in fact, give you the assurance that you might normally expect. If common criteria are going to be relied on, which NERC, SIP, and the new NIST protection profile appear to be driving towards, then there are some very, very difficult problems in this space. Common criteria evaluations, if done properly, are horrendously expensive. And from my reading of the common criteria protection profile that NIST has on their website, I would say that that isn't something you can really evaluate against. That's more or less a shopping list. It's a toolkit which a knowledgeable engineer could use to assemble a security target that would give real protection. But an engineer who had the wrong incentives could use it to assemble something that had the appearance of security, but which actually gave very little protection and didn't cost very much more than the vanilla product. Now, again, this is something of which we've got significant expertise in banking, because in banking, you had a typical problem, rather like anarchia. If you are Bank A and you put dodgy pin pads into all your merchant stores, then the vast majority of the cards that are compromised by people shopping at those stores will be cards issued by other banks. And so you end up facing only a small proportion of the total cost of the frauds that result from your negligence. Okay? So the incentive on all the banks was to go for security theater, as it's called, the appearance of security rather than its reality. Are the incentives going to be vastly different in the world of control systems? If they're not going to be vastly different, you've got the same moral hazard problem. And if they are going to be vastly different, then perhaps you don't need the same regulatory mechanisms. So there's some serious thinking to be done there. Multi-level security turned out, when the military did it, to be very, very expensive. I get the feeling, when I read some of the things that have been written in this space, that the power industry, for example, may be going for a multi-level approach to protecting SCADA systems, in the sense that you may have control systems, safety systems, and enterprise information systems. And if these are expected to operate at 3 different levels of dependability, then that will in some sense be the inverse of the stuff that you get in the military, where you've got top secret, secret, confidential, operating at 3 different levels of confidentiality. And if you end up, perhaps unwittingly, trying to replicate the different levels of dependability that are found in these military systems, then there's a surprising number of costs follow. And there's a whole chapter in my book about this problem. Next problem. What happens when an industry with a 15-month product cycle, such as the computer industry, comes into collision with an industry with a 15-year product cycle, such as the telecom switchgear industry? Well, the answer in that particular case was that the switchgear industry got completely wiped out. Companies like Marconi essentially ceased trading, and their market was stolen in its entirety by companies like Cisco. Is this going to happen here? Is Microsoft going to completely wipe out Honeywell and GE and ABB and so on? Well, clearly not, because if the kit is there in refineries and pipelines and so on and will be there for 25 years, then the same rapid pace of disruption simply isn't an option. But there will be some disruption, and are there useful models for thinking about it? Next thread, models of security investment and risk. Financial models, capital asset pricing model, life cycle models, comparison across industries. Should oil refining be spending more or less on information security than banking? Is this a valid comparison? Some governments seem to think so. What's the validity in that? Then there are supply chain issues. One of the things that we looked at in the past was security of mobile phone systems. And these turn out to be difficult to do because there's half a dozen people in the supply chain. ARM produces the CPU design, Infineon might make the chip, Symbian provides the operating system, Samsung builds the handset, Vodafone operates the network, Tesco sells you the phone. Who's responsible when something goes wrong? Well, everybody's tossing the risk either this way or that way over the fence. The same thing can't happen quite in control systems, because you do have end asset owners who at the end of the day face financial exposure if things break. But are there similar supply chain issues to think about? And if there are, then what has to be thought about in terms of design of contracts to minimize the exposures? Next point, compliance costs. One of the things that we've observed in general IT security is that over the past few years, compliance with Sarbanes-Oxley has driven a substantial amount of the investment in the USA, with much of the rest being driven by Graham, Leach, Bliley, and HIPAA. Do these do anything useful or anything harmful in the industrial control system space? So is there some way in which some new technology can come along which will drive the uptake of better protocols for communicating with sensors and actuators using authentication or whatever? Are smart grids that opportunity? Or would it be better to find something that's a bit more local, where the actual benefit goes to the plant operator or the network operator, which adopts a particular protocol? And again, what we can provide here are pointers to papers where people have studied what worked and what didn't work in terms of getting other security solutions out into the marketplace. So, to wrap it all up, security economics looks like it may have a bit to offer the control engineering community, because protecting SCADA systems seems to be not fundamentally a problem of technology. We know how to do things like crypto and protocols and so on. We've had that knowledge for years. It's intertwined with business structures, risk dynamics, and regulation. And there's a whole bunch of tools that we've developed over the years in other contexts for dealing with these problems in other industries. I've got a security economics resource page off my website that's got links to dozens and dozens of papers, conference proceedings, and so on. And I now have, as of last week, a new research student starting to do work on security economics. And we're looking for bits of beef for him to get his teeth into. So I'm very, very keen to hear about your problems. And finally, there's my book, which some of you may have read and others may find useful. Right, I'm happy to take questions if anybody's got any.
Okay, great. Thank you very much. I'm sure there's a few questions here. Now, when I hand you the mic for the question, if you could just give your name and company, no long introductions, but I'm Dale Peterson from Digital Bond, so everyone knows who you are. And for the virtual attendees, we'll announce who they are too.
Thank you. Thank you. Excellent. Very much enjoyed your talk. Wayne Mangus, Oak Ridge National Laboratory, a Department of Energy facility, U.S. government. One of the critical issues that I've seen as we have tried to find how to apply the tools that are available in the IT community, in the banking community, to, in particular, what we have come to call the Industrial Automation Control System rather than SCADA. SCADA carries a different kind of connotation. One of the challenges we've seen is the underlying assumptions don't apply. For example, Metcalfe's law. In a SCADA, or Industrial Automation Control System, a single link may carry the value of that entire installation. So Metcalfe's law does not apply at the very bottom layers, which is where I work. And so tools that assume Metcalfe's law don't apply. The other underlying assumption is that the value of the network, well, your statement that high fixed cost, low marginal costs. In a wireless sensor system, you have an infrastructure-less arrangement. There is no infrastructure using mesh networking. So the marginal cost, the initial cost is low, and the marginal cost is low. But you still need to be secure.
Sure. The reason that I went over Metcalfe's law and related matters was to point out that there are certain differences between normal IT and industrial automation and control systems. And I think once we've got a clear understanding of what precisely those differences are, it will become easier to read the existing IT security literature and say, right, we should pay attention to that, we should pay a lot more attention to this, and we can forget about the next thing. That's why I presented this framework to begin with.
Hi, Zach Tudor, SRI International. I just wanted to point out, you had mentioned near the end of your talk about a kind of multi-level dependability paradigm, and later on we'll be talking about safety systems and their impact on control systems. So on one level, there is a multi-level dependability kind of paradigm in the control system, industrial control system environment right now that we can talk more about. I also, you mentioned the costs of multi-level security, proprietary protocols, et cetera, in the defense environment. Lately, in the U.S., you may have noticed that we seem to be going back towards that. A big proposal for a military network protocol to sit on top of TCP/IP for security, multi-level security as part of the comprehensive initiative. What do you think is driving the everything old is new again, very expensive things that we're seeing in the U.S.?
Well, as a scientist, my concern is to understand the causes. And then with my engineering hat on, once I understand the causes, I can try and tweak the system so that it runs a little bit better. If you want to see what I've written about the costs of multi-level, then look at my book, Chapter 8, because I spoke to a great number of people who had the scars on their back from doing this through the 80s and 90s and trying to distill their expertise down into 20 or 30 pages. I reckon that some of that, though not necessarily all of that, will apply to multi-level integrity, Beaver model type stuff. As for layering more secure networks on top of less secure networks, that makes me slightly uneasy. One of the things that I've been looking at in the UK is our National Health Service network, which is becoming more and more life critical. You see, back in Y2K, when we looked at Y2K, we reckoned if the internet went down for a week, then so what, we'd get some work done. But you can no longer be so blasé about it, because in UK hospitals, for example, if you get an X-ray taken, the X-ray is no longer stored in the hospital. It's sent to a server farm in Swindon. So if you get wheeled in after a car crash, the X-ray your leg, that sits in Swindon, and you then get wheeled into the operating theatre. If the link to Swindon is down, you're suddenly back to World War I field hospital conditions. Right? The surgeon can't get the X-ray. And the problem there is that if you have got a network on which a lot of on which an awful lot of reliance is placed, and it's running on top of BT's packet switch network, then it may in some sense be protected from the internet. But if there is a really bad storm on the internet, then that's not necessarily going to be the case. And so you may find that if there is something dreadful happens in the internet, a zero-day vulnerability on iOS that people exploit maliciously, that many networks which people think are isolated from harm will turn out not to be.
Russ, I was writing notes like crazy as you were going through all these economic terms. One thing, though, that I couldn't quite get is when you talk about the Microsoft example or banking examples in that, talking about fairly large vertical markets with many, many systems. Is there any analog to the control system space where, while it's very critical, when you look at the total number of computing devices sold, it's relatively small? For example, if you talk to Microsoft about it, they really care about this market, but it's so tiny compared to the other things they do. So can you think of any maybe analog where you've got something that's very important but doesn't have maybe the large-scale market drivers of some of your other examples?
Well, there's a number of examples. You can look at specific verticals such as healthcare. You can look at particular applications in banking, for example, such as payment systems. Or you could look at military messaging systems. There have been various times in the past when Microsoft has talked to the NSA or the DoD about providing some kind of multi-level security, but then they say, how many machines might you guys buy? How many licenses might you buy? 500,000? Come on, we need 2 more zeros in the end. How can we get 2 more zeros in the end? So again, you have these problems that markets weren't big enough for the big vendors to be interested in.
Darren Highfield with Internex. Thank you for your presentation. One of the, actually to extend what Dale brought up just a moment ago, one of my particular concerns is that that this market is so specialized and balkanized in terms of the scenarios and the drivers, and this has its roots even in regulation, at least in the electric power industry. You've got 50 different regulatory markets just inside the United States. And so I think the coupling of the small number of systems and situations coupled with a really heterogeneous mix of drivers and issues, in my mind, creates an environment where your exceptions are going to dominate the landscape rather than generalities. And where in larger markets, things like economic trends can be very useful for pulling lessons and analogies. I'm concerned about our ability to leverage those lessons in a market such as ours.
Well, microeconomics is fundamentally about the study of incentives, and it doesn't really matter whether a market is for 100 million devices or 1 million devices or 1,000 devices. The same rules apply. Now, what we are basically suggesting is that these tools be used as a framework for doing conceptual and comparative analysis of the problem you're interested in, industrial control systems, and other problems that have been studied elsewhere. Now, let me give you two further examples. The first is voting machines. If you go back into the last millennium, the market for voting machines in the USA was enormously diverse, extremely balkanized. You had 50 different regulatory regimes. Each state authorized voting machine makers, some of whom were man and a dog operations. Somebody had written a vote tabulating program in Visual Basic back in 1981, and it was still used. Hey. Then, as a result of the Help America Vote Act, there's suddenly a huge rush for the trough, and you get 3 or 4 big vendors emerged with systems that weren't, as we now know, properly engineered, and you've had all the fuss since then. So that gives you an interesting analogy of how things went wrong when a balkanized market started being fixed up as a result of an external shock. Another possibility is to look at building security systems. This is something, again, that I write about in my book and that we've been working on in Cambridge a bit recently. Until a few years ago, if you went and bought a system that did burglar alarms and fire alarms, again, it was highly specialized and highly balkanized. It worked very much like industrial control systems. You got in bed with a particular vendor. In our previous building, we were with Chubb. And once you're in bed with Chubb, that's it. Their wiring is totally proprietary. All their door striker plates, sensors, and so on are totally proprietary. You put a new door in the building, that's $2,000 for a striker plate that cost them $5 to manufacture. Y2K came along. The software was no longer compliant, so they said, well, I'm sorry, but that's $20,000 for new software. There's nothing you can do except put your hands up and write the check. As a result of this, you now see people, small firms, selling things like door striker plates which run off powered Ethernet. And we're seeing the emergence of small companies which will sell you a whole building fire and alarm system just as a piece of software that will run on one of your servers. So all of a sudden, you can do your building control much more intelligently. You can run it the way you run the rest of your systems administration. You can hook it in to your systems administration. You can do role-based access control. You can start hooking it in with building energy management. And this is probably going to completely trash the existing vendors of building control systems. Why? Because it's completely outside their space, it's outside their business model, it's outside their expertise. They don't have the right salesmen, they don't have the right programmers, they've got nothing. So there are another 2 examples that you can use for comparing the world of industrial control systems with other worlds that have been significantly disrupted by this move to modern computing and networking technologies. Now, whether you call that economics or not, I think that's of clear and present interest to this community.
Miles McQueen, INL. This question is about software vulnerabilities from a defensive perspective. And you mentioned Rescorla, and I'm doing this from memory, but as I recall, he checked out the null hypothesis of whether the null hypothesis being that software does not get more secure as you identify vulnerabilities and fix them, and he couldn't reject that hypothesis. And then I think Osment and Schachter followed that up and with BSD and said, well, gee, you find vulnerabilities and fix them, and software may get more secure over time, but it's at a very slow rate. And then I think even later, maybe unofficially, that was called into question. So given that, my question from an economic standpoint is, should anybody in the white hat, again, defensive side, be interested in actively pursuing finding new vulnerabilities, whether it be government, vendors, owner-operators?
Well, Andy Osment was one of my research students and his thesis is possibly worth a read if you're really interested in this field. He wrote a paper with Stuart Schechter, Milk or Wine, Does Software Improve with Age? And he found that in the particular case of OpenBSD, it does improve with age because vulnerabilities are correlated. And this means that once you fix a vulnerability, you can fix similar vulnerabilities and the software actually gets better. Now, in the 2 or 3 years since that research was done, I reckon that the research has become significantly more true and powerful and effective. And the reason for this is that people in companies like Microsoft have taken it to heart. And if you report a vulnerability to Microsoft, they don't just fix that bug. They fix up their static analysis tools so that every similar bug everywhere in Windows and Office and IE and everywhere else also gets fixed. Because they learned the hard way that if some particular type of format string vulnerability is present here, the same idiot who wrote it, you know, somebody who fell rich and left the company 10 years ago and didn't document anything, has probably left 27 of them in other places in the code base. Now, if the software that you're worrying about is anything like similar, and I don't see why it shouldn't be, then again, this is the approach that should be taken. You go and find vulnerabilities before the other side do, not so that you can patch individual vulnerabilities, but so that you can remove whole classes of vulnerabilities. Now, this gets us into the field of discussing a whole lot of stuff about compilers and analysis tools and so on. But I do believe this is the way forward. We're just on the point of starting to fix buffer overflows, and the next load of vulnerabilities, concurrency vulnerabilities, are coming around the corner. But this is a matter not just of fixing bugs, but of fixing classes of bugs. And once it's seen in that light, I think the problem goes away.
Okay, let's one more question. Brian, did you have a question?
Hi, Ross. Brian Owen from OSI Soft. Thanks for the presentation.
Thanks.
One of your earlier concepts about networks and the incentives for achieving a kind of a monopoly status suggested that the cost would be of security would be added later and maybe even pushed all the way to users. Do you see that in the sense of the internet itself going to a place where end users might have to pay to play on the internet? Is there sufficient monopoly established that cost will push all the way to the end user?
Well, we pay to use the internet in various ways as it is, and this basically gets us into the topic of telecoms regulation, which brings in a whole lot of other cans of worms. And it's possibly too big a question to have a single compact answer, because there are too many aspects to it. There's the platform aspect, you know, Microsoft issues. There's the cloud aspect, Google issues. There's the local access issue. There are censorship issues. There are quality of service issues. And hey, I think we better talk about that over lunch.
Okay, well, thank you very much. That was great.
Thanks.